Rarely, if ever, has a new Australian government embarked on such a frenzy of overseas activity as has the new Albanese government. Since taking office in May, the Foreign Minister Penny Wong has set a blistering pace, visiting more than half a dozen countries.
I think that shows it's a government that might see room for Australia to project to the Pacific, to Southeast Asia and elsewhere, that we are a sovereign country, allied with America, but still capable of striking out on our own.
I think they are not just talking, they're showing that they're actually serious about this relationship, and hence the visit and the time spent to come and visit the Pacific.
Minister Wong has embarked on this frantic round of shuttle diplomacy to turn around one of the biggest potential strategic threats this nation has faced since World War II, growing Chinese influence among Australia's Pacific Island neighbours, highlighted by the security deal between China and the Solomon Islands.
We fear that China wants to set up a military base to interdict Australian vessels. I think there's a lot of psychological projection about that. That's not what China is actually trying to do. The prospect of Australia losing influence or even not being the preferred partner of choice of the region is something that we've long tried to avoid. And I think the new government is doing whatever it can to change that in our favour. Pacific
partners themselves don't wish to see a militarisation of their region. They've been clear in making that statement plain. It's important that we support them in a way where they are as strong as possible to withstand any pressure, coercion or other influences that would undermine those rights or their sovereignty.
Over recent years, Australia's relationship with many of the Pacific countries has become strained, primarily due to Australia's climate change policy.
Under the last Australian government, they dropped the ball a bit in the way they handled its relationship to Solomon Islands in terms of the issues surrounding climate change and also in terms of trade, social interaction between Australia and Solomon Islands.
Although Peter Dutton apologised for the comment, it marked a low point in relations.
And I cringed with embarrassment at that statement. It just confirmed to those Pacific leaders, such good friends of Australia's, that we were contemptuous of what happens to be their deepest concern.
But Australia's record on climate change can't be the only explanation for why some Pacific countries have flirted with China, given China is one of the world's biggest emitters.
China seems to be doing something about its climate change activities and about its emissions. It hasn't adopted a denialist attitude, and China has been able to successfully portray the view that it's actually a developing country, not a developed country. There's a huge infrastructure funding gap in the Pacific which China can meet.
The economic challenges of what ordinary Solomon Islanders feel in terms of their livelihoods and being able to provide for their families is an everyday focus for them. And if they decide that China is going to be the one providing this infrastructure and this economic improvement in their lives, then that's where they would go.
It's unlikely that Australia will be able to match China's financial contributions to the Pacific. But on top of the money offered for infrastructure, there have even been suggestions that China has personally bribed Pacific politicians.
You asked a question about bribery or corruption. We don't pay off, we don't bribe people. The Chinese certainly do.
I have no doubt that they are doing it. I think knowing the style China does, not only here in the Pacific, but in other parts of the world, this is how they do business.
Anote Tong, the former president of Kiribati, says the challenge for Australia is to work out what it can offer the countries of the Pacific to ensure that it, rather than China, remains the preferred partner. It sounds very much like you're saying that in the battle for the Pacific that Australia is losing to China at the moment.
I think it's on the way to losing if it doesn't really pick up and find a way to counter these very, very aggressive initiatives by China.
The Pacific is not a homogenous group, with several nations refusing to sign the deals proposed by China.
I think China too also misunderstood the fact that while we are a Pacific family, we all have our different needs, and our governments are aware of it too. And I think they will have to learn how to handle China and when to say no and when to agree to certain things.
In its many trips around the Pacific, the Albanese government has been stressing its target to cut emissions by 43% by 2030, a plan that's been welcomed in the Pacific.
I think what Foreign Minister Wang has done is a start. I mean, there is no substitution for personal interaction. I'd always been hoping that Australia would lead us, tackle the world in this battle on climate change.
It's definitely given the Pacific Islanders a lot more excitement and hope from what was probably a decade of neglect.
Beyond the challenges in Australia's neighbourhood, there are questions about our alliance with the US. Former Foreign Minister Bob Carr says the new government needs to focus on achieving a more independent foreign policy. Has Australia become a lapdog of the United States?
I think it's even worse than just being a lapdog. I think we've shown the level of independence you'd have from Puerto Rico or Guam, American territories.
Given you're well known as a supporter of the US alliance, it's surprising to hear you say that Australia's become a lapdog.
My view is that we can be allied because the American alliance is in our interest. But we would have extra authority and more depth to our international character if the world believed that we could strike out independently from the US.
Far from forging our own path, the recent AUKUS agreement locks Australia firmly into Washington's strategic direction. As tensions between the US and China continue to grow, Australia could find itself dragged into a conflict over Taiwan.
The challenges posed by a more assertive China are real. We'll only know with time as to whether these meetings are going to yield benefits, particularly those within the Australia-China relationship, and whether we do see those trade sanctions removed over time.
The economic situation in the United States with inflation and high interest rates may see the Republicans win the House and the Senate in 2022, and either Donald Trump or somebody else like Mike Pompeo become the United States president in 2024. And that once again brings American foreign policy into the realm of unpredictability, which is very different to what Australia has always been used to. And in that case, Australia's got some very serious thinking to do about armed neutrality.